And it's code in the data, give the keyboard a punch, then cross, correlate, and a break for some lunch. Correlate, tabulate, process, and screen. Program, print out, regress to the mean. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it? Program it right. Nothing ever happens in the...
Well, welcome back to my Stata video series. In this video, we're going to look at a number of ways of examining a Stata data set and trying to understand it in preparation for your analysis. Mostly this video will support people who are taking my class SOCY 699C, which is an introduction to statistical programming in Stata, but others might find it useful as well. In particular, the commands we're going to look at in this video include describe, list, summarize, Tabstat, tabulate, and codebook. Those are the core sets of commands that allow you to understand a new data set, both in terms of the kinds of variables and the quality of data included in that data set, and numerical summaries or interpretations of that data set. As you can see in the background, I've got Stata fired up, and I've loaded up the General Social Survey data set. You can go look at another video on how to access this data set if you'd like to do this exercise or follow along in the video and work on these commands. I've also created a short Stata program file that has all the commands in it that we're going to look at today and some of the variations of all of these commands. Primarily the distinction here is, or the differences here are in the options that we use. So here's the file that we're interested in, and I'll go ahead and plug these, copy and paste them into the command line so we can examine them in detail. I want to remind you that anytime you're confused about any Stata command that I use or anybody else uses, there is extensive online documentation. For example, our first command is describe, and if I come down to the command line and I type in help describe, I get detailed information immediately on how to use this command. Particularly, I like this summary up top on the syntax, which we've covered in a different video, but it tells me I can use a varlist here. It says I have options I can use, and you can see the options down here. So again, anytime you see a command you don't understand, please access that help file. So here I've got the General Social Survey data set all loaded up. It's a large data set with a large number of variables, and one thing I'd like to do is begin getting a handle on what those variables are. I can just type in the command describe, and you see that it runs very quickly, and it's listing all of my variables in a description. Now if I go to the top of this, you see that there is no top, that I'd like to know what each of these columns represents and what the information contains. But there's so many variables in the General Social Survey, and the buffer size in my results window is small enough that it can't all fit in, so some of the initial information is pushed out. So one of the commands that we'll learn, or one of the ways of using describe, is to limit it to a smaller set of variables. There's a set of variables in the General Social Survey that deal with confidence in American institutions, and I'm listing these here. You can see now my describe command, which I've shortened to DESC. Again, use the help file to figure out the shortest version possible. This isn't the shortest version, but I like this version. This will now provide me that same descriptive information, but only on these variables. And so when I use the enter key, you see I get a much smaller set of variables here. The information included here are the variable name, variable type, which is an important piece of information if you need to save storage space for your file. Remember, Stata is limited to storing all of its data in the memory, and if the data set gets too large, you won't be able to access it. You can save space by storing your variables efficiently. It tells me the display format, and the issue here again, as we've discussed before, think of a spreadsheet where you enter a number into a cell on the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet understands that number the way you entered it, but you can choose to display it in different ways, with a percentage sign, with commas, how many decimal places, and so forth. It doesn't change the number that's stored, it just changes the way it's displayed. The next column is value label. Value labels are things that a programmer creates to make data more understandable. For example, if we consider the variable sex in the General Social Survey, which is an indicator of whether a respondent is male or female, we would find out that people who are coded 1 are equal to male, and people who are coded as equal to 2 are female. The male-female is the value label, and the underlying number is the value itself. So these are the names of the value labels attached to these variables, and we'll show you how to decode those and how to figure out what they are. Finally, you get a variable label, which is a brief description of what the variable contains. So you can see that the variable con, BUS, con biz, is the confidence in major companies. Con clerge is the confidence in organized religion, and so forth. Not all data sets come with these variable labels, and if they don't, I certainly advocate that you create them for your data set to make your data set easier to use. Same thing for value labels. Not all data sets will come with value labels, but it's often easier to use your data set and understand your data and interpret your outcomes if you have meaningful labels attached to those underlying values. So there's the describe command. Again, there's a couple of other options that you can use with describe that tell you the number of variables and how big the data set is, but we'll put those aside for now. One final option that's useful in the describe command is the option called short. The short option, this is often given at the top if you list variables here, but I'm only listing, but I don't want to list all the variables. This tells you the number of observation, number of variables, and data set size. So when you have a large data set, don't want to look at all the variables, but want a quick summary of what the data set is, use that short option to gain that information. Let's move on a little bit and look at the list command. So here I have 4 different versions of the list command in my command file. The first one is going to list out values for these variables only if the year is equal to 2012. In 2012, we had a lot of different, we have a large data set with thousands of cases, and so this will go on again for page after page. So here, now to execute this command, I'm simply going to click on this execute selection button, and there's my output. And again, if I roll back through my data set and look for the top of this data set, it again has run off the screen because the size, the amount of information able to be contained in my results window is less than the amount of information being displayed on the screen. But we know that these are the variables from left to right that I listed in that command. So from left to right, it's the confidence in business, confidence in clergy, confidence in labor, and so forth. And they're only for year 2012. Furthermore, you can see that there are value labels, and the value labels here are truncated, and we'll look at a way to figure out what the value labels tell us in more detail in a bit. But they have things like hardly, a, only, some, and so forth, which tell you what the value labels are, not the underlying values. And then finally, you can see that we have some missing data, and they're listed here as the .i's. Sometimes I like a listing that doesn't have the box around all this output. You see how it's separated with the lines and the boxes? And so I can use the clean option. This output is identical to the one before, but just notice that it got rid of the box. Our next example uses the clean option over here and then adds the no obs option. No obs stands for no observations. Again, identical output as the previous 2 commands, except that now we've deleted the observation, or we're not displaying the observation value. Finally, I can use the no label option, which is the last option out there. So I'm going to use clean to get rid of the boxes, no obs to suppress the display of the observation number, and no label to show me the underlying values. So instead of showing the value label, that hardly, any, and only, some, and so forth, we're going to display the underlying numerical value. And you can see that output here. Now we get a better sense of what a value label and a value is. The value is the number stored by Stata. The value label is something that a programmer codes that adds something that is substantively interesting and adds a context to the measurement. Let's move on and look at the codebook command. The codebook command is something you only run once, typically run once when you get a new data set or after you've made when you've created a subset of data. And it provides a record of all the different variables and detailed information on each variable. Here I'm going to execute the codebook command for a single variable, the confidence in business. You can see here that we get a fair amount of information. We get the type of variable, which we also got in describe. We got the label that's attached to this. It tells us the range of values, how many unique values, and so forth. It tells us some information about missing data. And finally, we get a frequency distribution. And the nice thing here is we now get a look at the values, the 1, 2, and 3, and the value labels, a great deal, only some, and hardly any, that are attached to those particular values. It also shows us how the different missing values are coded. We can run this for all of the variables that we're interested in, and you'll see that we get a lot of output. And so again, we would typically run this only at a time when we've got our complete data set constructed, and we want to log this output and save it in a file on our hard drive, so if we ever need to go back and look at individual values. This is one way of documenting your data set. Let's go back to our program file. We finished all the ways of understanding the data set by basic inspection of the names of the variables, how many variables, how big the data set are, the kinds of values that they contain. And now we can move on to a numerical understanding of the data set. So here we're going to look at the commands summarize, tabulate, and Tabstat. Let's move on and go back to our program file and look at the next section of program code. Well, once we've taken kind of an overview look at our data by listing out some values of the data set and using the describe command and maybe creating a codebook, we can start looking at numerical information about our different variables. One command I really like to use is the summarize command. It wasn't the first command I learned in Stata for summarizing data. I learned Tabstat first, so truthfully I kind of gravitate towards Tabstat. But the summarize command is a lot easier because it doesn't have many options and we get a lot of good information. Let's go ahead and run the summarize command for a single variable, this confidence in business variable. And you can see we very quickly get a look at the name of the variable, how many observations, mean, standard deviation, minimum, and maximum, with no options whatsoever. So we're getting a pretty good look, and actually for GSS data in particular, I really like the minimum and maximum, so I get a sense of whether this is a variable with a lot of potential variability, or whether it's a categorical, discrete variable, and so forth. You can also use some of the by and by sort commands we've used that we've shown in other videos as a prefix to this command, and that turns out to be pretty useful as well. The one option that you may choose to use if you don't have too many variables to look at, or if you want to drill down into this single variable, is the detail command. You can see with detail, not only do you get those basic summary statistics, but you also get a set of quantile statistics, the percentiles. You also get a listing of your largest and smallest values, which here is not a big surprise, it's just 1 and 3. And you get a little bit more detailed statistical information. Here's what summarize looks like if we run it on a large number of variables. A nice compact statistical summary of these variables. It gets me into a basic understanding: where's the middle, how are cases distributed around the middle, and what's the range of possible values. Tabulate is another way to drill down into your data. So again, I'm going to look at the single variable confidence in business and use the tabulate command to show me a one-way frequency distribution of that particular variable. So I like this option a lot. Once I know I have a variable that I'm interested in, I want to see what the specific value labels are, and I want to see the distribution across those value labels. If I'm concerned that I don't fully understand the numerical values underneath those value labels, I can use the no label option, and I get the exact same frequency distribution, but this time it doesn't display the value labels, a great deal, only some, and hardly any, but the underlying values of 1, 2, and 3. The tabulate command can't be used to look at more than one variable the way describe and list and summarize can, but we can use the tab1 command to make a long listing of the single univariate distributions of all of these variables. So again, this output can be voluminous, not so bad here because I have a limited number of variables, but if you did this for the entire general social survey, it will take a long time to run, produce a lot of output, and really too much information to be useful. So I'm going to use the varlist, the optional varlist here, to limit the scope of what I'm looking at. And now you can see, and I can scroll back through here, I get one-way frequency distributions of all my confidence in American institution kinds of variables. There's also a command called Tabstat. Tabstat produces summary statistics, and it has many more options than the summarize command. And on the one hand, it's good because it lets you pick the details of your data that you'd like to look at, but on the other hand, does require you to spend a little more time building your command to produce the information that you're interested in. Let's look at a single variable. If I issue the Tabstat command for the confidence in business variable, I get a simple arithmetic mean. I don't get a sample size. I know here it's quite large. It's over 32,000. I don't get a standard deviation, no center dispersion. The default is simply a mean. Of course, I can substitute a variable list or a varlist for that single variable, and I get a nice way of comparing the means of all these confidence variables across the variables. Now we can start looking at some of our options. I'm going to create that same Tabstat output for all of those variables, but I'm going to use an option called statistics, and I'm going to specify the statistics I would like to examine. Sample size, mean, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, and quantile measures, 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile. I'm also going to make the statistics appear in the columns, so I get a nice output that looks like this. I could also make the variables appear in the columns, that's the default, and the statistics in the row, but I prefer this kind of output, which allows me for each row to look across and see all of the summary information about it. Because of the limited range on this variable, it only ranges from 1 to 3, you can see that things like the percentiles are really not that useful here, but they'd be useful for continuous kinds of data. If I just delete this option, this columns options for statistics, you can see what this command produces. And here we have our variables as the columns and our statistics as the rows. And you may prefer this output, and it's fine. I like looking at it the other way. Here I'm adding an option to look at a single variable, the confidence in business variable, but I'm adding the option to do this by year. So it will produce all of those summary statistics by year for this single variable. If you have cross-sectional data or panel data, this is one way you can look at how things change over time. In this case, we'd be looking at changes in average over time, not changes in responses over time. And we get, again, a nice compact look at the data. So here you can see the confidence in business in 1973 across all of the years with all of those statistics. And this is something like if you were plotting a trend line of changes in averages over time, you might plot that mean column. Of course, you may prefer to have a great deal of confidence be coded 1 and hardly any and only some be coded 0, and you could then calculate proportions and plot the proportions over time. That might be more meaningful, but that's a judgment call on the kind of story you're trying to tell with your statistics. Final use of this Tabstat that I like, here I have all of my confidence measures, and I'm curious about what years they're available in the General Social Survey. As you know, the General Social Survey doesn't ask every question in every year. There are often skips of certain years. Notice that I'm using all of my variables, I'm adding a by year option, and I'm requesting a single statistic, which is sample size. So you can see here, if I back up a little bit, for each variable we get the sample size for every year. Obviously in 1972 we are missing data, and the other row with all zeros we're missing data. And some years have some fewer cases than others, but in general, this is a great series of data asked almost every time the General Social Survey is fielded, and asked of typically a very large sample of 1,000 or greater. So that concludes this video and the information about how to look at a data set and examine the variables to see what they are and what they contain, and get a statistical or numerical summary of those variables. We looked at the describe command, the list command, summarize, tabstat, tabulate, and codebook. All of those commands let you use the if and in and different kinds of modifiers to subset or limit your data. Almost all of those commands, I think all of those commands, let you use a variable list or a varilist in Stata Ease to, again, subset the data to just particular variables. And all are very powerful, and if you have any questions about them, obviously feel free to contact me or use the help command in Stata to look them up for more detailed information.
And it's code in the data, give the keyboard a punch, then cross, correlate, and a break for some lunch. Correlate, tabulate, process, and screen. Program, print out, regress to the mean. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it? Program it right. Nothing